one witnessed the burial. That was by design. According to accounts passed down through Mongol tradition, the men who carried Genghis Khan's body to its resting place were killed afterward. The soldiers who killed them were killed next. The site was then ridden over repeatedly, reportedly by cavalry, until no mark remained on the ground. Some accounts describe trees being planted. Others mention a river being deliberately diverted to run across the grave. Every trace of the location was meant to vanish. It worked. 800 years later, one of the most consequential figures in world history remains the most successfully hidden corpse on Earth. No confirmed tomb, no verified grave, not even a direction with strong consensus. And the question of where he was buried has always carried a second, quieter question underneath it. One that historians, archaeologists, and researchers have been circling for decades. What was buried with him? Because the accounts that survived describe more than a body. They describe wealth on a scale that even today is difficult to fully comprehend. And they describe precautions so extreme, so methodical, that they suggest whoever organized the burial was not simply protecting a man. They were protecting something they believed could not be allowed to resurface. This is the story of what Genghis Khan may have hidden with his body, and why the search for it has never fully stopped. To understand what was buried, you first have to understand how much there was to bury. Genghis Khan, born Temujin, likely sometime around 1162 on the steppes near the Onon River, did not come from wealth. His father was poisoned by rivals when Temujin was still a child. His family was abandoned by their clan. For years, he survived at the margins, learning how fragile power was and how quickly it could be taken. By the time of his death in 1227, he had built the largest contiguous land empire in history. His armies had crossed Central Asia, the Middle East, China, Persia, and deep into Eastern Europe. City after city had fallen. Treasure after treasure had been absorbed into the Mongol Empire. Persian gold, Chinese silk, and imperial artifacts. Silver from the Islamic world, weapons, horses, jewelry, relics, and the accumulated wealth of civilizations that had existed for centuries before being swept aside in a matter of seasons. The great Khan did not keep all of it. He distributed enormous amounts to his generals and his people. Mongol loyalty was built partly on plunder. But even after that distribution, the personal wealth associated with Genghis Khan and his immediate court was extraordinary by any historical standard. And at the moment of his death, much of that wealth had no clear accounting. The circumstances of his death remain themselves genuinely uncertain. The official narrative, if you can call anything about this period official, says he died in August 1227 during a campaign against the Tangut kingdom of Xia in what is now northwestern China. He was in his 60s, which was old for a man who had spent decades on horseback, in battles, in extreme climates. But the cause of death has been debated since almost immediately after it happened. The most widely cited explanation in later historical sources is that he fell from his horse during a hunt and never fully recovered. A fever followed. His condition worsened over weeks. Some sources describe an infection, others describe internal injuries that couldn't heal. But other accounts preserved in texts from China, Persia, and the Mongol tradition itself suggest different possibilities. One persistent tradition holds that he was wounded during the Xia campaign, struck by an arrow. Another, recorded in some Chinese chronicles, claims he was killed by a captive Tangut queen who concealed a weapon. That account is difficult to verify and carries the marks of later storytelling, but it has never been fully dismissed. The secret history of the Mongols, the earliest surviving account written from inside the Mongol tradition, is strangely silent on the precise cause of death. For a document that records battles, betrayals, marriages, and the character of enemies in remarkable detail, the absence of a clear account of how the great Khan died is itself unusual. What is not disputed is what happened next. The body was carried north, the funeral cortege moved across difficult terrain, and the accounts of what accompanied it grow more dramatic as you move through the historical record. Some sources mention that anyone encountered along the route was killed to prevent knowledge of the procession's path. The scale of this, if accurate, speaks to how seriously those organizing the burial took the question of secrecy. This was not a gesture. It was a systematic effort to eliminate witnesses. The destination, according to most accounts, was somewhere in the region of Burkhan Khaldun, a sacred mountain in northeastern Mongolia that Genghis Khan had venerated throughout his life. He had reportedly sought refuge there as a young man when pursued by enemies. He had prayed there. He had spoken of it as a place of power and protection. But Burkhan Khaldun is not a precise location. It is a region, a cluster of mountains and forested ridges in the Khenti Range, covering hundreds of square kilometers. And within that region, the burial site was hidden with such thoroughness that no credible identification has survived 8 centuries of searching. The question of gold follows directly from the question of secrecy. Because the burial precautions documented in historical sources go well beyond what you would expect for a man, even a great one. They suggest that something in addition to the body required protection. Mongol burial tradition in this period was not elaborate in the way that Egyptian or Chinese imperial burial culture was. The Mongols generally did not build monuments to their dead. They did not, as a rule, construct the kinds of treasure-filled tombs that have been excavated across East Asia. The steppe tradition leaned toward concealment, toward integration with the landscape, toward a philosophy that the dead returned to the earth without leaving a mark. But Genghis Khan was not an ordinary figure, and the accounts of his burial suggest that ordinary practices were both followed and significantly exceeded. Medieval Persian historian Juvaini, writing in the 13th century from within the Mongol court world, described burial traditions among the Mongols in terms that included significant offerings to the dead. Animals, weapons, belongings. These were not unusual accompaniments in steppe burial culture. What varied was scale. For a man who had controlled the wealth of half the known world, the question of what was interred with him is not easily dismissed. Later Mongol tradition holds that Genghis Khan's burial included horses, potentially many of them. Horses were the fundamental unit of Mongol power and identity. A warrior buried without horses was a warrior stripped of his place in the next world. For the great Khan, the scale of that accompaniment would have been significant. Some accounts describe personal weapons, the bows and swords of a man who had fought since childhood, objects with biographical weight, not just material value. And some accounts, less verifiable, filtered through decades or centuries of transmission, describe gold. Not as decoration, but as objects, vessels, instruments, items of ritual or political significance. One persistent tradition, referenced in several secondary historical analyses, describes a yuan or treasury cache associated with the burial. Wealth removed from circulation precisely because it was tied to the Khan's person and could not be redistributed without disrupting the symbolic architecture of succession. In this reading, the gold was not simply valuable, it was politically dangerous. It represented a kind of concentrated legitimacy that his successors needed to contain. That interpretation fits with the broader political context of the burial. Genghis Khan died leaving an empire in mid-transition. His son, Ogedei, would become the second great Khan, but the succession was not automatic or frictionless. The Mongol tradition of dividing the empire among sons created structural tensions that would, within 2 generations, fracture the empire into competing khanates. In that environment, a cache of wealth closely associated with Genghis Khan was not just a treasure. It was a source of authority. Whoever controlled it, or whoever could credibly claim knowledge of it, held a lever over the legitimacy of the entire succession. Concealing it, making it inaccessible to any single heir, may have been a way of preventing that lever from being used. Or it may have been a way of reserving it for a future moment of reunification that never came. Neither explanation is proven. Both are consistent with what we know of Mongol political culture in the years immediately following 1227. The search for the tomb has a long, complicated, and occasionally controversial history. For most of the past 8 centuries, it was effectively impossible. Mongolia's geography, vast, remote, with limited infrastructure, made systematic archaeological survey impractical. The Mongol people themselves, for much of this period, treated the approximate region of the burial as sacred and protected. There was no appetite for excavation and strong cultural resistance to the idea. In the 20th century, that resistance took on additional layers. Soviet-era Mongolia discouraged research into Mongol imperial history, which was ideologically inconvenient. The nationalist fervor surrounding Genghis Khan was managed carefully. Access to the Kenti region was restricted for decades. After Mongolia's transition to democracy in the early 1990s, international archaeological interest increased significantly. Several major projects launched in the following decade, combining satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and traditional survey methods. One of the most prominent was the Genghis Khan Geohistorical Expedition, which worked across multiple seasons in the early 2000s with international collaboration. Researchers covered large portions of the Kenti region using aerial survey and remote sensing. They identified anomalies. They examined sites. They did not find a tomb. Another significant project used high-resolution satellite imagery and crowdsourced analysis, distributing image sets to thousands of volunteers through an online platform. To scan terrain for archaeological signatures, that project identified numerous sites of potential interest across Mongolia. None confirmed as the burial location. The absence of discovery is not simply a failure of technology or effort. It may be a result of the burial's success. If the accounts of deliberate concealment are accurate, the killing of witnesses, the destruction of ground markings, the possible diversion of water, then the site may have left no surface signature at all. The traditional archaeological indicators that lead researchers to burial sites in other parts of the world may simply not exist here. There is also the question of preservation. 800 years of Mongolian weather, seismic activity, and ecological change could have altered the landscape significantly. A river deliberately diverted in 1227 may have returned to its original course within years. Trees planted over the grave would have grown, died, and been replaced many times over. The earth essentially may have finished the work that the burial party started. But the search continues for reasons that go beyond archaeology. Because the question of what is buried with Genghis Khan touches something larger than the location of a grave. The Mongol Empire connected for the first time in history the trade networks of Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, and China into a single political space. Goods, people, ideas, and diseases moved across that space in ways that transformed every civilization it touched. The Black Death, most historians now believe, spread westward along Mongol trade routes. The Renaissance, in some readings, was partly enabled by the influx of Chinese and Central Asian knowledge that Mongol connectivity made possible. The man at the center of all of this, the figure who set that process in motion through decades of conquest, left almost no verified physical trace. No confirmed portrait painted during his lifetime. No authenticated personal object in any museum. No grave. That absence is remarkable in world historical terms. Rulers of far smaller domains left more behind. The pharaohs of Egypt built mountains to mark their resting places. The emperors of China surrounded themselves with armies of terracotta soldiers. Even minor medieval European kings left tombs, effigies, relics. Genghis Khan left nothing that can be confirmed. Some historians have argued that this is itself the answer to the question of what he hid with his body. What he hid was the man. Not gold, not weapons, not political relics, but the possibility of a focal point, a grave that could be visited, venerated, or politicized. A physical location where the idea of Genghis Khan could be concentrated and used. In this interpretation, the secrecy of the burial was an ideological act. The empire was too large, too dependent on the idea of Mongol unity, to allow the founder's remains to become a contested shrine. By making the grave inaccessible to everyone, it became inaccessible to any single faction. No one could claim exclusive proximity to the Khan's body. No one could build authority on the basis of proximity to the tomb. That is, in its way, a more sophisticated political calculation than any treasure cache. But it doesn't rule out the treasure. Both things could be true. The concealment could have served multiple purposes simultaneously. The body and whatever accompanied it could have been hidden for reasons that were at once spiritual, political, and material. And those reasons need not have been fully separable in the minds of the people who carried out the burial. Mongol cosmology did not draw the same lines between the sacred and the political that later Western frameworks tend to impose. The Khan's spiritual power and his political authority were not distinct categories. The objects buried with him were not simply wealth. They were extensions of his person, his protection, his continued presence in the world he had made. Hiding them was not separable from hiding him. What makes the question endure beyond the straightforward appeal of buried treasure is what it implies about the nature of power and its relationship to material objects. Every major civilization has grappled with this question in its own way. The Egyptian practice of tomb building was partly about ensuring that the pharaoh's power extended into and beyond death. The Chinese practice of burial with terracotta armies and grave goods served similar functions. Even the Christian tradition of saints' relics, the belief that physical objects associated with holy figures carry spiritual force, reflects the same underlying logic. Genghis Khan's burial inverts that logic. Where other traditions sought to concentrate power through physical monuments and material accumulation, the Mongol practice, taken to its extreme in this case, sought to dissolve it. To return the Khan to the earth without leaving a handle that anyone could grip. Whether that worked depends on how you measure it. The empire he built fragmented within 2 generations. The great Khanates, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in the West, diverged and eventually collapsed. The political unity that might have required a focal tomb never materialized in the way some of his successors perhaps hoped. But the idea of Genghis Khan did not dissolve. It survived without a physical anchor. It traveled through oral tradition, through the chronicles of his enemies, through the reverence of his descendants, and eventually into the modern world, where he remains one of the most recognized names in human history. The grave in this reading was not necessary. He hid his body and his gold when if he hid gold at all, and the empire still remembered him. The lack of a monument did not diminish the legacy. It may, in ways that are difficult to fully quantify, have protected it. A tomb can be looted. A tomb can be desecrated. A tomb can be seized by a rival and stripped of its meaning. A grave that no one can find cannot be touched. The searches continue. Technology improves. Satellite resolution increases. Non-invasive scanning methods develop. The Mongolian government has, in recent years, worked to balance archaeological research with the cultural and spiritual sensitivities of Mongolian people, for whom the question of the burial site carries a weight that is not purely historical. There is real resistance among many Mongolians to the idea of excavating whatever site might ultimately be identified. The view that the Khan's resting place should remain undisturbed is not simply sentiment. It is a position grounded in a coherent understanding of what the burial was meant to accomplish and what disturbing it would mean. Some researchers have argued that the most respectful and historically responsible outcome would be to identify the site through non-invasive methods, to know where it is, to protect it, and to leave it sealed. Others believe that excavation conducted with appropriate care and in partnership with Mongolian institutions and communities could yield historical information of extraordinary value. The material culture of early Mongol imperial burial, largely unknown because so little has been confirmed, would be illuminated. Questions about the objects, the practices, the physical reality of the man himself could receive answers that no document has been able to provide. Both positions have legitimate grounds. Neither has the authority to resolve the question on its own. What remains, for now, is the absence. A mountain range in northeastern Mongolia holds a secret that has survived 8 centuries of political upheaval, technological change, and determined searching. The most powerful man of his age arranged for his own disappearance with a thoroughness that has not been matched since. And beneath the surface of that landscape, beneath the rivers and the forests and the long grasses that have grown and died across 800 winters, there may be objects that no living person has seen. Objects that were placed in the earth with deliberate care in a process that cost many lives to keep secret, for reasons that were political and spiritual and personal all at once. Whether those objects constitute treasure in the conventional sense, or whether they are something harder to categorize, extensions of a man, markers of a moment, physical remnants of a world that ended when he did, is a question that cannot yet be answered. Because the grave has not been found, and until it is, the question of what Genghis Khan hid with his body remains exactly what he intended it to be: open.
I am the archivist. The past is never as silent as it seems. Subscribe to Forbidden Science and return for the next mystery.